Welcome to another edition of Ask a Zookeeper autocomplete questions. We're going to go to the internet and see what questions people have about birds. I previewed these ones because our prefix is how do birds, and I wanted to make sure that there was lots of good questions, and there's enough for 2 parts, so we're going to make the next 2 videos during this break into that. One thing I noticed though is that people are very overly interested in bird reproduction and the mechanics of it. And maybe we'll cover that in a future video. But for this one, anytime you see one of those red lines, that is somebody asking a question about bird reproduction. So I'm going to censor those so we can keep this family friendly. So let's start. We're going to have the prefix how do birds, and then we're going to add letters afterwards to see what people are interested in asking. How do birds fly? They flap their wings. They do have some interesting adaptations, though. They have hollow bones. They have feathers, obviously, that have a high surface area but don't weigh very much so that they can push lots of air. And then they also have hollow air pockets inside of their bodies that reduce their weight even further. So they are highly adapted to flying. That's why humans can't just strap feathers onto their arms and start flapping. One other adaptation is that birds have highly developed muscles. Their pecs are enormous, so they're really, really strong, and that's how they're able to fly. How do birds sleep? I made a video about this, so you can watch that to get more details, but there's 2 things that are kind of interesting. One is that they have locking mechanisms in their feet, so that if they're standing on a branch and they go unconscious and they fall asleep, their feet will lock closed so that they don't fall off the branch, even though they are not paying attention or they don't have voluntary control over their muscles. So their feet are just clamped on and will not let go no matter what until they actively release it. The other thing that's really interesting is their brains. Okay, so birds are able to sleep both half of their brains at the same time, just like us. But then if they're in an unfamiliar environment or if they're migrating, as they're flying up in the air or as they're sitting on a branch in an unfamiliar area, they can close one eye and they can sleep the opposite half of their brain. So by changing sleeping duties between the 2 halves of their brain, they're able to sleep while still keeping an eye out for predators and being safe. How do birds see? Very well. They use their eyes. How do birds drink? This is actually an interesting question because birds don't have lips, so they can't seal their mouths around a straw or to drink water the way that we can. Because they have a beak, their seal is really bad. So almost every type of bird, if you imagine that this is their beak, they have to dip down into the water, they get a beak full of water, and then they tilt their head back and the water flows down their throat, and that's how they swallow. That's one of the unique things about pigeons. If you ever see a pigeon drinking, it will stick its beak into water and it'll just keep going. It has 2 different points in its beak where it can generate suction. So it can seal with its tongue and it can seal with its esophagus. And it uses that to pump water into its mouth. But it's still not drinking the same way that we do. A surprisingly interesting question. How do birds age? Pretty well, actually. So birds are not at the top of the food chain for the most part. They're hunted by other birds like eagles that are at the top of the food chain, or they're hunted by snakes and other kinds of animals. So a bird wants to look like a normal, healthy bird for its entire life. So parrots or songbirds, they'll reach their adult size as quickly as possible, and they'll try to look like an adult because predators will preferentially hunt for young, old, sick, or injured birds. And so they try to hide all those things very, very well. How do birds breathe? This is a really hard question to answer. I'm going to have to do a separate video on this. So I'll put a link when I eventually do make that video. The reason is that I barely understand it myself. It is a very complicated system. So there's 8 air pockets inside of the bird's body, and they have lungs that are pass-through lungs. So the air pockets are piped in such a way that on every inhale and exhale, the air flows through their lungs in the same direction. How do birds breathe inside of eggs? That's a good question, because if you're looking at an egg, you'd be like, hey, it's sealed inside there. How does it breathe? But there's tiny little holes for it to breathe. That's how it does. How do birds communicate, or how do they chirp? The way that we talk is we have a set of vocal folds that's in our larynx. Birds actually have two sets of vocal folds that are in similar structures that are called syrinx, syrinx. And so they can produce two different sounds at the same time. Birds also have very fine control over the muscles in their syrinx, so they can make incredibly complicated sounds. How do birds chew? They don't. They don't have teeth. How do birds decide who leads the V? I have no idea, and that's a fun question, because you imagine like the birds voting on who's like the best flyer, the best leader. They probably all just take turns. I like the concept, though. It's a good question. How do birds die a natural death? Naturally. So that's part one of the two-part Ask a Zookeeper autocomplete. If you actually do have a question about birds, leave it in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer it for next time. If you are watching this video close to when it comes out, we're about halfway through our 8-week break at this point. I'm still not back, but I just wanted to put up a video so that you could see that I'm still here and I still care. So there will be one more of these, and then we'll get back to normal episodes. I have a few great ideas that I'm excited to do once we are done with the break. In the meantime, take care, and thanks for taking the time to learn what makes life awesome.